Hey, listeners, I'm so glad to have you back. Today, we're going to talk about something that might seem a little out of the blue. This is a weird intro, I know, but it might not because it's Halloween time. And so maybe it makes sense. But also, you might be like, well, I never really thought of it that way. And that's kind of my hope, is that you never really thought of it that way. Let me give you a little backstory about why we're here. So, the question, first of all, is what do I do if Halloween specifically, but let's just talk about holidays in general. But what do I do if Halloween is not what my kid wants? That's kind of my summarization of the question. I got a couple different questions, mostly revolving around kids who have anxiety about Halloween or who just don't like the experience of Halloween. And it might be kids that you would expect that from, like maybe some, exceptional kids, twice exceptional kids, or spectrum kids on the spectrum. Like you might expect that from them, but it also happens to kids that don't have any diagnosable reason for why Halloween would be hard. And I always think, and I guess I'm obviously biased, because I always think it's best in these kind of situations to go back to the principles that I talk about all the time with explicit parenting, which, if you're unfamiliar, explicit parenting is sort of my summarization of ways that I think we should all be approaching parenting. And it sounds like, explicit lyrics or explicit whatever, but really the word explicit is on purpose to insinuate that it is the opposite of implicit or hidden or assumed. So let's just dive in. And I'll give you a personal story too. So I have 3 kids, wildly different in some ways, similar in other ways. But one of the wildly different things was my youngest had a lot of sensory integration trouble as a kid. Still does, probably, but really as a kid had a lot of sensory integration stuff. Was never diagnosed on the spectrum, was never diagnosed with ADD, was never diagnosed with true sensory integration disorder, was given a general anxiety diagnosis. I think probably, now that I know what I know based on the other side of the table, I think was given that diagnosis because it just didn't check enough boxes because he was really high performing. And so there wasn't enough impact. I think probably if we went back and looked at it the way that we do now, I don't know that he'd be on the spectrum, but there'd definitely be something else going on. There's definitely some neurodivergence in this one. Anyway, I digress. The whole reason I'm telling you that is because Halloween was no fun in those early days. The costumes were scratchy. The environment was scary. The chaos of the classroom, even in the most non-chaotic classrooms, just the difference in structure and schedule for the day was always alarming. There was a parade at their school when they were little. That was alarming. There was a lot about Halloween that felt assaulting to this little person. And it took me a long time to sort of figure out, he didn't articulate it right away because he couldn't. And his moods were such that it wasn't necessarily standing out as any worse than some other days. But anyway, eventually we figured out that Halloween was not their favorite thing, and we regulated around that and helped support around that. But we hear a lot about co-regulation. Maybe you don't hear as much, but parents are hearing a lot about co-regulation. How do I co-regulate my kids? How do I, regulate their emotions? How do I this? How do I that? How do we teach them these things? And those are all wonderful things to talk about. But you can't do that if you don't. Number one of explicit parenting is know your own self. If you haven't identified your own triggers and then your own expectations for a specific thing, let's stick with Halloween. If you don't know your own triggers about Halloween and you don't know your own expectations around Halloween, then it's that much harder for you to help your small human regulate around Halloween. So, for instance, if you grew up loving Halloween and having the greatest memories of Halloween, then it's going to be really disappointing to you if your kid doesn't like it. On the same path, but a totally different outcome, if you grew up like me, where Halloween was a bit of an emotional difficulty because we couldn't afford it. My mom was not crafty, nor did she have any money to buy costumes. And I grew up in the heyday of buying the plastic mask, gross plastic, like flammable costumes. That was my childhood. And my mom, we didn't have the money for that because it was one day and she didn't see the value. but also was not at all crafty. So it wasn't making me anything. So I grew up with Halloween being like socially difficult. I don't know that anybody else noticed, by the way, but I did, that I was, either a hobo back in the day, really, really thoughtful, or, a punk rocker. Like those were my options pretty much every year. One year, I think I went as a bride because I had a costume left over from being like the Virgin Mary. So I could wear that as looking like a bride. Anyway, the point is, I grew up not loving Halloween, but not because I was afraid of it, but because it just wasn't ideal. And so I thought as a parent, okay, I'm going to do everything I can to make Halloween ideal for my kids. I'm going to buy them the best costumes. I'm going to do it up for them. And those are my expectations. And this kid was like, I don't care. There's no costume in the world good enough for me to feel good in. Or what was even more difficult was that some years he thought there would be a costume good enough for him to feel good in. And then it didn't. He didn't. He was scared by something else, or he didn't like trick-or-treating, or whatever the case. Halloween was never great. And I was always, in the early days, thought I'm doing it wrong because Halloween should be great for him. I'm trying to give him everything I didn't have, and he's still upset about it. Anyway, I'm telling you all this to tell you, I had to figure out my own stuff before I could even begin to help him. And some of my own stuff was his Halloween experience is not a reflection of my parenting. I cannot place value. I cannot tie my own value as a mother or a human to his experience of a holiday. And that sounds really obvious. I'm sure you're listening like, duh, of course you can't. But those are the things we do without realizing it if we're not tuning into our own stuff. If we don't know ourselves well enough, we have no idea that's what we're doing. We just know we're upset, he's upset, they're upset, it doesn't matter. And so step one of this whole co-regulation process with your kids is know your own stuff. What is the stuff that's going to trigger you? What's the stuff that's going to make you feel bad? And what are your expectations for this thing that may or may not be met? Because that is what you actually have to deal with, your own expectations and how this might look different than what you wanted it to or how you thought it was going to. And what does that mean or say to you? Because the second step of explicit parenting is know your end game. What do you want from the experience? Why? Why do you think that's important? Or what do you think that's going to change? And then what do you want from the relationship? I wanted to provide for my kid. I wanted to provide these experiences. I wanted them to look at me and go, my mom is amazing. Look at what she was able to do for me for Halloween. She's the best. And first of all, that's unhealthy. And second, it's impossible to do that all the time. I can't control his perception of something. So for me to tie my worth to it is an impossible task for both of us. And it's like so much pressure on the kid to like do things a certain way to make me feel good. So I had to understand like, that's actually not the relationship I want. What I want right now is for this kid to feel good, full stop. Like once I tuned into that, like, oh no, what I really want is for my kid to feel good, not for me to have some perceived thing. And him feeling good isn't necessarily going to look the way that I think it should or could look. So I had to peel back and realize like, oh, I'm triggered because I think I'm not providing the experience that helps him. When in reality, I'm actually not trying to help him. I'm trying to provide an experience that I think is helpful. And he's trying to tell me it's not. So I had to know my own, my own values, my own triggers, my own expectations. And then I had to like really understand, well, wait, I what I want from this relationship is for him to be good, to feel good, not for me to be rewarded by something, which is how I was behaving in the beginning. So with your own kids, whether it's Halloween or something else, what are your expectations for this thing and why? What do you think is going to happen when this thing create comes up? It makes it easier then to take it when they go, I hate this, or this isn't what I want at all. It makes it easier because then it's not personal anymore. They're not saying this thing you've created for me isn't working. They're saying this thing isn't working. So what can we do about it? And then this third and fourth parts of explicit parenting are be curious, not judgmental. In other words, listen, don't assume, listen. And again, if you don't know yourself and you don't have an understanding of what your end game is, you're going to assume every time. You're going to try to, like, it's fair, right? You know your kids probably better than anybody, but is your perception the reality? We all think we know our kids, but are we really paying attention to them, or are we building the story around what we see and we're not getting curious about what's underneath it? So if you listen to them, what do they want? what makes them feel good? What doesn't make them feel good? Does what they want change what you think you're going to do? I just had to adapt some things with mine. It's not like he didn't want to celebrate the holiday. It's not like he didn't want to be part of his class. It's not like he didn't want to do any of it. But I had to ask him, like, well, what's the part that stinks? And what's the part that has you? And in those early days, he didn't really know. He just knew he felt bad. When they're little, they don't know. They don't have, or they can't articulate exactly what it is. They just know, this feels uncomfortable. And so maybe it's the costume, maybe it's the noise of the Halloween party, maybe it's the expectation that they're supposed to have the best costume. Maybe, this is a kid with generalized anxiety. It could be any number of things that they're thinking are supposed to go a certain way. And I can't intuit that. And so I'm doing it a certain way and they don't feel like they're matching their own expectations. But if you listen, if you ask them some questions, if you get curious about what's behind this, instead of just trying to fix it, which is what we do as parents, we jump in and go, oh, my kid's uncomfortable with this thing. Well, I'm going to change that. If we learn to be a little bit more comfortable with their discomfort, we can sit in it longer to get to what's underneath it. Our sort of natural reaction, I think, as parents is to be like, I don't like when my kid's not well, so I'm going to jump in and do whatever I can to shake this up and move it around as fast as I can. But the truth is, if we can go in and be like, I see you're uncomfortable and I want to really, truly help with this. So I'm okay sitting here taking that discomfort for a while until we get to the bottom of it. The listening is the part that is probably the most important part after figuring out your own stuff. And figuring out your own stuff can make listening a bazillion times easier because you no longer are uncomfortable yourself. So you can sit with their discomfort easier. If you don't really know what's going on and your whole expectation is they always need to feel good, I always need to make sure they're feeling good, I always need to make sure everything's good, then you cannot handle your own discomfort, much less theirs on top of it. If you know my end game here is that they feel good, I don't need it to look a certain way, I don't need it to be a certain way, I actually don't care what it is as long as they get through it okay, then you can sit with the discomfort because you realize you're not through it yet, you're in it. And it's okay. You're going to get to a different outcome. This isn't going to be where you stay. So if you do the work to find out who am I, what am my triggers, what are my expectations, how do I want this to look, and how do I want our relationship to be, and what do I want out of this experience, and is that possible with this child? Once you do that work, finding out from them, listening to them is just much, much easier. And then the fourth step of explicit parenting, be consistent, be persistent, be explicit, have the tough conversations. That's just sort of something that's ongoing always. You can put it in this situation, but also it's just part of everything. Once you know them better, you will be consistent. You will provide the scaffolding or the support they need because you know them, you know what they need. You will be persistent in finding out, in being curious and getting to the bottom of it, in knowing every year it might be a little bit different. And the explicit part is asking, bringing them into it. They're part of the team. Our kids are their own individual human beings, and they need our help and they need our support and they need our guidance at times, but they don't need us to do everything for them. They need us to say, hey, we're here as the stable figure and we want to work this out with you so that eventually you do these things on your own. I had to first work with my kid to help them be able to notice and articulate what it was, but they were never going to do that if they didn't believe I was on their side. If I was there to support them, whatever those answers were. If I didn't create the safety for them to say, here's what's happening for me, here's what I need, they never would have gotten there. They would have just continued to throw temper tantrums and get in trouble in school. But I was able to say to them, hey, I see you, and I see that this isn't really working, but I don't exactly know why, but I want to do whatever I can to help. So how can you and I do this differently so that it does work? I would love for you to enjoy it, but if you don't want to, okay, it's got to be safe enough for them to make decisions. Even when they're really little, it needs to be safe enough for them to feel like they can say, I don't like this, or this isn't right for me. And if you have an expectation, they're going to pick up on that energy and they're not going to feel safe telling you that they're not going to meet your expectation. So start at the beginning, know yourself, know your triggers, know your expectations, so that at the end, this consistent, persistent, explicit part also include in that grace for yourself. You might grieve some things, it's okay to grieve your expectations. It's okay to, it's not offensive to your kid. It's not offensive to parenting in general. It's not offensive to anybody if you acknowledge, I thought it was going to go this way and it didn't. And that makes me a little bit sad. It's okay. I don't love anybody any less. And I'm not actually any worse off as a result. But I am a little bit sad that it's not going to go this way. It's okay to admit that and to give yourself a moment of grace for that. The kid doesn't need to know it, but you can take the time, talk to a friend, talk to a partner, talk to a therapist, talk to somebody and say, like, this is a thing I thought it was going to happen and it didn't. And I just need a minute to be sad about that. Again, knowing yourself, it is helpful for you too, because you can give yourself the grace to feel sad about it. Oftentimes when we're doing that, when we grieve, it can feel like guilt. You say, like, I feel bad that it's not this way because his life isn't going to be any different. But actually, if you're honest with yourself, that guilt is grief. It's, oh man, I'm missing out on this, or I'm sad that he's missing out on this, but he's not really missing out on it. He's fine, or she's fine, or whatever the case may be. Like they as humans are fine. They feel loved and supported, and they got exactly what their needs met. You are the one that didn't get what you wanted in this moment. And it's okay to give yourself a little grace for that, to feel sad about that. Don't feel guilty that you're sad. And I think that's probably the number one thing that I see with co-regulation is that parents think they're supposed to be able to be everything at all times for their kid. And that's not what co-regulation is. Co-regulation is helping your kid learn how to manage their emotions on their own, including sometimes showing them what happens when you don't do that well. Because if you are the kid and you have a temper tantrum, or you do something that is sort of out there and you wish you didn't, imagine how much harder it is if your parent never has a misstep, never loses it, never screams, never yells, never does anything wrong. How are you going to feel about yourself? Like, oh my God, my mom never has this issue. And I'm not condoning like you yell and scream at your kids, but I'm saying having a moment where you don't regulate your emotions is actually a perfect teaching moment for a kid to be like, oh, this just happened. I don't feel good about that. And I want to do it differently next time. So here's what I'm noticing. It happened because I'm tired. It happened because I'm hungry. It happened because this isn't going the way I wanted to, and I'm upset about it. But I can't treat anybody like that. I shouldn't be treating anybody like that. So I'm sorry for what I just did, and let's move on from it. That's such a great lesson for the kid to be like, yeah, I'm going to mess up sometimes, but that doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. And it doesn't mean I can't come back from it. So the number one thing I see with parents is that they think they're supposed to be perfect all the time. They think that co-regulation means I'm never supposed to have a moment where I lose my stuff. And I'm never supposed to yell at my kids, and I'm never supposed to be angry at my kids. What? And not only that, but we are being asked now to spend so much more time with our kids than ever before, and be so much more involved in the day-to-day running of their lives than ever before, that of course you're going to be frustrated and mad and angry, because it's not the only thing you're doing. I'm sure you're out doing a million other things during the day. You're probably working, or you're raising other kids, or you're volunteering somewhere, or you're doing something that takes the other part of your brain so that you're exhausted a lot of the time. You're having a hard time regulating your own emotions, much less helping someone else co-regulate theirs. So rather than feel guilty about that, start to know what you need to come to a situation less I don't want to say fragile, less frazzled. How about? And give yourself grace in the moments where you're too frazzled to do it any differently, because it's going to happen and it's fine. It's fine. I just saw Dr. Becky get, upset. People upset with her on the internet because she used the term repair, which apparently is from a psychological intervention called DBT. I did not know that. I use the word all the time. I did not know it was part of DBT. And either she didn't either, or she just thinks it's so ubiquitous. It's not like I have to credit somebody for this, but whatever. I'm not speaking on her. What I'm speaking on is she was talking about repair and how important the repair process is, because we're all going to mess up. We're all going to yell at our kids. We're all going to say things we don't mean. We're all going to do things wrong. This kid that I'm talking about, that's my own, that didn't like Halloween. I didn't get it right away. I kept trying to force him to do things or tell him it was going to be fun, or, discount his own feelings because I thought, well, clearly if he just does it, he'll be fine. I did it wrong multiple times before I finally figured out, oh, I'm doing what I think I should do rather than listening to him for what he needs. I did it wrong a bunch, but I was always there for the repair. I was always there to support him and say to him, I'm sorry that it worked out this way. I'm sorry for my part in it. I'm sorry that I didn't hear you the first time. I hope he would tell you as an adult that he always knew I was on his side. And that is the powerful part. Not the couple times I lost my cool, or multiple times I lost my cool. Let me not kid around. That I yelled in frustration, that I slammed a door, that I walked out of a room, that I left him to cry by himself. Like, those aren't what shaped him, because I came in and gave him some background and some support and some apology for those moments. So I'm hoping that's what shapes him, that safety of knowing I was going to be here, even if I wasn't handling myself very well at the time. So this is a little bit all over the place because this is a massive topic. This is such a massive topic. Co-regulation, like, how do I co-regulate my kid? I probably should have started with what even is that? Maybe we'll do another episode fully on co-regulation. But because this one was specifically around Halloween and around expectations and anxieties around Halloween, I felt really compelled to talk about it quickly. And I had a lot of personal stuff to go into it. I had a kid that was just very different from the other two when it came to Halloween. Actually, any kind of really big school holiday, but that's an episode for another day. But I know, because I've heard, there are lots of kiddos like that out there. There's a lot of kids that are not into things the way that their parents think they might be, or that they should be, or that they wish they were. And so it's really important, I think, for the parents to take a step back and examine their own selves first. Understand your expectations, understand your triggers, understand where you're coming from when you come at these things in that way. What's the reason for that? And then what do you want out of this relationship with your kid? And what do you want for your kid out of this experience? Because it probably isn't what you're doing at this moment. You don't want both of you to be miserable. I can guarantee that. So what is it that you really want out of it? Ultimately, what I wanted was just for my kid to feel good about himself. I just wanted him I wanted him to feel safe at home and good about himself out in the world. And if that meant, he made his own costume that triggered me because it was homemade and didn't look very nice and wasn't as cool as the other kids, that's my own stuff that I'm dealing with. He was fine going out into the world like that with some creative thing he made up that nobody could probably tell. That was my stuff that was triggered. So I needed to know that. And then that allowed me to be able to listen to him and what he really wanted and needed, and then be consistent in providing it, consistent in that safety. Even when I messed up, being consistent in the apology and the repair, and then giving myself grace and realizing, like, nobody's perfect. Of course, I want him to have a different Halloween experience than I had, because I didn't have a great Halloween experience, but it doesn't look like I think it would for him. He had a great time once he was allowed to do what he felt supported in doing. You go to 4 houses to trick or treat, and then you come home, and that's it. You don't have a big sack of candy like the other kids. It never bothered him. It always bothered me that he didn't have the same amount of candy as the other kids, or that we would, force him up to certain houses. And it always bothered me. But then I realized it does not bother him at all. So what do I care? What I really want out of this is for him to feel good. And that's happening. But you can't do any of that if you don't know what your own self, what your own inner kid is looking for in this. So step number 1, always with explicit parenting, is know yourself. Go back to the episodes where I talk about tuning in, or what do I want, or how do I get there? Because that is imperative. If you don't know your own stuff, if you don't know your own triggers, if you don't know your own expectations, you can't possibly help your kid co-regulate their stuff. That's it. I could literally talk about this all day, but I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself around and around and around. So I'm gonna end it here and say, there's other episodes. We can put those in the show notes of how to co-regulate and how to work with your kids and how to understand their emotions and how to understand your own emotions so that you can go through that. There's also a book. My explicit parenting book is out there. I actually think it's free on Amazon right now too. So if you want to look for that, it's there too. I don't have it here to show you if you're watching the video, but it's on my shelf back there. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and good luck this holiday season. And we'll talk more about what to do during the holidays with kids and with yourself. But for now, start with knowing your own expectations, knowing your own end game for the relationship and for the experience, and then consistently moving forward with your kid from there. You got this.